Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heartfelt story about Ly Tu Tieu and baby Henry, a journey back to the quiet countryside where love, trust, and second chances are tested. From long separations to the whispers of old gossip, from tender moments to life-changing promises, this is a chapter filled with emotions you won't want to miss. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. The drive back to the farm was mostly quiet. Only the low hum of the engine and the occasional cry from baby Henry in Tu Tieu's arms broke the silence. Yesterday's rain had left the air fresh, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil. Ly kept his eyes on the road, but every so often he glanced at Tu Tieu, still unsure if she really meant to stay this time. When they reached the old wooden gate, its hinges squeaked as it swung open. Ly stepped out first, reaching for the bags before Tu Tieu could. "Let me take those," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Inside, the stone pathways were damp, puddles reflecting the pale morning sky. They entered the house, where the air was cooler. Ly set Henry's things down carefully, pointing to a spot by the window. "It's cooler here. He can rest," he said. Tu Tieu nodded, lowering the baby onto a mat. Her movements were instinctive, tender. Ly brought over a mosquito net, draping it with care, as if protecting something far more fragile than just a child's sleep. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the farm stretched quietly, resilient despite its neglect. The vegetable patch was overgrown, and the chicken coop needed repair. Tu Tieu's gaze followed the scene, and a faint sigh escaped her lips. "Things have changed," she murmured. Ly's reply came without hesitation. "Because you weren't here." It wasn't an accusation, just a truth that had been hanging in the air, waiting to be spoken. The silence between them wasn't heavy, but it carried the weight of absence, of misunderstandings, of words left unsaid. And yet, beneath it all, there was still a thread, unbroken, that had pulled them both back here. Morning sunlight spilled across the yard, catching in droplets still clinging to the leaves. Ly handed Tu Tieu a broom. The gesture was wordless, but full of intent. She took it without hesitation. Side by side, they began sweeping the courtyard, the steady scrape of bristles marking a quiet accord. From the corner of her eye, Tu Tieu saw Ly walk to the chicken coop, scattering feed with practiced ease. The hens clucked in reply, their sound blending into a kind of homely music. A faint smile crept onto her face. This was the rhythm she'd once known, the one she'd left behind. When Ly called her over to the fish pond, she followed, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. The pond surface rippled as feed hit the water, silver flashes darting just beneath. "They've grown," Ly said quietly. "Faster than I expected." Tu Tieu crouched beside him, the breeze lifting her sleeve. "Maybe they were waiting for you to come back," she replied, her voice almost carried away by the wind. They moved through their work without hurry, sweeping, feeding, checking the vegetable patch. Ly paused, leaning on the broom handle, watching Tu Tieu carry a basket toward the shed. "From now on," she said, catching his gaze for a brief moment, "I won't make you worry like before." Something in his expression softened. He didn't answer right away, just let his eyes linger, as if memorizing the way the sunlight caught her profile. farm felt different now, not because of the chores, but because of the quiet steps they were taking, together. By late afternoon, the air was scented with damp soil and fresh feed. Uri came back from the small market, carrying a basket, fresh fish, a bundle of greens, and a few eggs wrapped carefully. Tu Tieu was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing vegetables under a thin stream of water. He set the basket on the counter. "For dinner," he said simply. "You didn't have to," she began, but he only shrugged. "It's been a long time since we ate together here." The kitchen soon filled with the sizzle of oil, the rhythmic chop of a knife, and the soft shuffle of footsteps. Now and then, their eyes met. Brief, unguarded moments. Outside, dusk folded over the fields, windows catching its fading gold. When they sat down, the meal was simple. Steamed vegetables, fried eggs, and the fish Uri had brought. He watched as Tu Tieu took her first bite. "Good?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Good." Halfway through, Uri spoke, breaking the quiet. "If you stay, don't leave again." It wasn't a demand, more like a wish too heavy to keep inside any longer. Tu Tieu set down her chopsticks, steam rising between them. She met his gaze, a small but certain smile curving her lips. "I won't." In that moment, the farm outside seemed to still, as if it too were listening. Between the soft clink of bowls and the hum of evening, a promise, fragile yet steadfast, took root. Night came gently. The air cooled, and the last traces of sunlight slipped behind the hills. In the kitchen, the faint warmth of their meal still lingered. Henry slept soundly in the next room, his quiet breathing steady in the hush. Uri stood by the counter, hands resting on its edge. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, drawing from somewhere deep, he began, "You know, people talked. They had opinions about you, about us." His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of years. Tu Tieu didn't move, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the flicker of an oil lamp. She knew those words were true. The whispers, the sideways glances, the questions no one dared ask directly. "I've carried those voices with me," Uri continued, "but none of them mattered as much as the thought of you here with me." He turned, closing the distance between them. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn velvet box. The room seemed to grow quieter. "I don't want you to just stay for a season, or until things feel easy again," he said. "I want you and Henry here for the rest of our lives." He opened the box. The silver band caught the lamplight. Simple, unadorned, pure. Tu Tieu's eyes glistened, her unspoken answer trembling there. She didn't speak, but her hand moved slowly toward his. It wasn't the end of their struggles. Morning came with the gentle murmur of voices in another house. Uri's sister sat with their mother over tea, the sunlight spilling through the doorway, catching in the steam that curled from their cups. "I'll be going back with my husband and the children soon," his sister said, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Their mother nodded slowly, her thoughts wandering elsewhere. "I just wish Uri would settle down," she murmured. "Then I could leave here for a while without worrying." There was affection in her tone, but also a quiet urgency. Years had made her wary of leaving her son alone, not just in the house, but in life. She spoke about her last trip to the countryside, about cooking for Uri, and of the quiet hope that someone else might one day take over that role. The screen door creaked open as Uri returned. "You're back late," his sister teased, though her eyes were curious. He smiled faintly, setting his bag down. "I took Tu Tieu and Henry back to the farm," he said. "We had dinner there." Their mother's gaze softened. She asked no more, but perhaps she sensed something had shifted in him, a steadiness she hadn't seen before. Uri excused himself, saying he had work upstairs. As he climbed the steps, the voices below faded into a low hum. Voices of family, of expectation, of bonds pulling in different directions. But for the first time in a long while, Uri felt those ties weren't chains. They were roots. Roots deep enough to hold, even if the wind rose again. The next morning, Uri's sister stood at the doorway, already dressed to leave. "Before I go," she said, "I want to see Tu Tieu and the baby." Her voice carried warmth, but there was also something else, perhaps unfinished business. Uri glanced at his watch, then nodded. "I'll take you." The road to the farm was lined with fields still damp from last week's rains. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. When they arrived, Tu Tieu was sitting on the porch, Henry resting against her shoulder. She stood quickly, greeting them with tea and a shy smile. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. They began with small talk: the weather, the fish pond, the grapefruit trees, but soon Uri's sister's gaze grew steady. "About what happened before?" she began, her voice careful. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to speak so harshly." Tu Tieu lowered her eyes, steam curling upward from her teacup. "It's in the past," she said softly. The words felt like closing a door, one that had been left ajar for too long. Henry stirred, and Uri stepped forward, taking him into his arms with ease. His sister reached out, brushing the baby's cheek. A smile broke across her face. "He's a good baby," she said. "If you ever need anything at all, tell us." They sat in quiet contentment for a while. No grand gestures, no speeches. Just the slow weaving back of trust, thread by thread, in the soft morning light. When it was time to leave, Uri carried his sister's bag to the car. The gravel crunched beneath their steps, fading as they neared the gate. Tu Tieu stood on the porch, Henry's small hand curled around the fabric of her shirt. "Take care of yourself," Uri's sister said, her eyes lingering on Tu Tieu a moment longer than necessary. "And take care of him," she added, nodding toward Henry. Tu Tieu gave a faint smile. Her reply was quiet, but steady. "I will." The car's engine started, its low hum cutting into the stillness. Uri looked back once before getting in. The glance was brief, but it carried the weight of last night's promise, one neither of them had spoken of since. When the dust finally settled, the farm was wrapped in silence again. Tu Tieu walked back inside, laying Henry down where the afternoon light pooled across the floor. She sat beside him, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the curve of his cheek. The memory of Uri's words from the night before returned, clear and unshaken. "I want you and Henry here for the rest of our lives." She closed her eyes, not to escape the thought, but to hold it closer. Outside, the field swayed gently in the wind, as if the farm itself was breathing with her. Somewhere between the quiet of the room and the soft rustle of leaves, she felt it, that fragile, persistent pull toward staying. It wasn't yet an answer, but it was the beginning of one. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the wind and to Henry's steady breathing. Yuri's words echoed in her mind, sinking deeper each time she remembered them. Somewhere between the silence and the leaves, she realized her heart had already moved closer to his than she dared admit. That night, the sky over the farm was clear, scattered with stars that seemed closer than usual. Tu Tieu stepped outside after putting Henry to bed, the cool air brushing against her skin. From the porch, she could see the outline of the vegetable patch, the faint shimmer of the fish pond, and beyond that, the hills sleeping under moonlight. Uri was there, leaning on the wooden railing, his gaze somewhere far away. When he noticed her, he didn't speak. He simply reached out his hand. She took it. No words, no promises spoken aloud. Just the quiet press of fingers that said more than either of them could at that moment. For the first time since coming back, Tu Tieu felt the knot in her chest loosen. Not everything was forgiven, and not everything was certain. But something had shifted. Maybe home wasn't just a place you stayed in. Maybe it was a person you chose again and again. Uri's thumb brushed over her knuckles, grounding her in the present. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of leaving. She felt like she was already home. After months apart, Uri reunites with Tu Tieu and baby Henry, bringing them back to the farm. Surrounded by signs of neglect, they begin working side by side, sweeping, feeding animals, and restoring the land. Shared routines slowly bridge the distance between them. Over dinner, Uri asks her not to leave again, then quietly offers a silver ring, promising a life together. The next day, family conversations reveal hopes for Uri's future. Uri's sister visits Tu Tieu, offering an apology for past harsh words. Trust begins to rebuild, thread by thread, as they share tea and moments with Henry. When the visit ends, Tu Tieu reflects on Uri's proposal, feeling an unspoken pull toward staying. Under the quiet of the farm, with the wind in the fields and Henry's steady breathing, she realizes her heart may already have chosen home.